Margaret Calloway pressed her last dollar into her palm, standing in the middle of a Wyoming dirt road with her trunk at her feet, and the door of the land office still swinging shut behind her. Harlan Bowes had not even looked back. He had taken her letter of introduction, read it, folded it, tucked it into his coat pocket, and told her the position no longer existed, all while his employer, Judge Victor Aldridge, watched from behind a glass window and smiled. She had traveled 1,900 miles for that smile. Stay with me until the very end of this story and drop your city in the comments so I can see how far Margaret's fight has traveled. If this story moves you, subscribe to this channel and follow every part, because what happens next will change everything you believe about a woman who had nothing left to lose. The town of Clearwater, Wyoming Territory, November 1878, did not stop moving for a woman standing in the road. Wagons rolled past her. A man in a canvas apron swept dust off the general store steps without looking up. Two women in calico crossed the street on the far side, heads angled away from her, as if poverty were something that traveled through the air. Margaret stood with her spine straight and her carpet bag clutched in both hands, and told herself she was not going to cry. She had not cried when her father died. She had not cried when the firm of Aldrich and Moore let her go the week after the funeral, citing a reorganization of clerical staff that had nothing to do with clerical staff and everything to do with the fact that her father's debts had become her reputation. She was not going to cry now. She had a letter. That was what she told herself. She had a letter signed by one Harlan Bowes assistant to the Office of Casper County Land Registry, offering her a position as senior legal transcriptionist at $12 a month with room and board. She had a letter and 3 years of experience reading land contracts at a law firm in Philadelphia. And she had been 3 days on a train and 4 hours on a stagecoach, and she had her father's leather satchel over her shoulder with every document she owned inside it. She turned back toward the land office. The sign above the door read, "Aldridge Land and Title. Victor Aldridge, Justice of the Peace." She had not noticed the second line when she arrived 20 minutes ago. She noticed it now. She pushed the door open. Harlan Bowes was sitting at his desk. He was a thin man, with a narrow face and eyes that never quite landed on anything directly, always skipping to the left of whatever he was supposed to be looking at. When Margaret walked back in, his eyes went to the window. "Mr. Bowes," she said, "I would like my letter of offer returned to me." "Miss Calloway." He folded his hands on the desk. "As I explained, you explained that the position no longer exists. You did not explain why you sent me this letter 6 weeks ago confirming a start date of November the 4th. Today is November the 4th. Circumstances change." "Circumstances." She set her carpet bag on the floor in front of his desk and opened her satchel. She pulled out the letter, unfolded it, and laid it flat on the desk facing him. "Your signature is on this document, Mr. Bowes. The terms are specific. Senior legal transcriptionist, $12 per month. Room and board provided through the county office. Is that your signature?" He looked at the window again. "Is that your signature?" she repeated. "It is." "Then I would like to know the legal basis upon which you are nullifying a written employment agreement without notice or compensation." From behind the closed door to the inner office, a voice said, "Let her in, Harlan." Bowes stood. He did not look at her as he opened the inner office door and gestured for her to enter. Judge Victor Aldridge was a large man, broad through the chest and neck, with silver hair swept back from a wide forehead and a mustache that had been groomed with more care than most men gave to anything. He sat behind a desk that was bigger than it needed to be, and he had the particular stillness of a man who had not been told no in a very long time. There were land maps on the wall behind him, dozens of them. Margaret looked at them before she looked at him because the maps told her more than his face would. "Miss Calloway," he said pleasantly. "Sit down." "I'll stand, thank you." Something moved behind his eyes. Not anger, amusement. He leaned back in his chair. "I understand you're upset. That's reasonable. There was a miscommunication." "There was no miscommunication, Your Honor. There was a written offer and a broken agreement. Mr. Bowes acted prematurely. The position was contingent on certain approvals that did not materialize. What approvals? He smiled. Administrative. Margaret looked at the maps again. She had spent 3 years reading land contracts. She knew what a surveyor's boundary line looked like, and she knew what it looked like when boundary lines had been redrawn. Several of the maps on Aldridge's wall had boundaries that did not match each other, despite covering the same territory. She looked back at him. "I see," she said. "Harlan will arrange for your return fare to Philadelphia." "That is generous." She picked up her satchel. "I will be staying in Clearwater for the time being." The amusement left his face. "There's nothing for you here, Miss Calloway." "I'll be the judge of that." She paused at the door. "No offense intended, Your Honor." She walked out through Harlan Bowes' office without stopping, and back through the front door into the street, and she stood in the November cold and took one long breath and thought very carefully about her situation. She had $11.40. She had her father's satchel, her carpet bag with 3 days of clothing, and approximately the same number of allies in Clearwater, Wyoming, as she had in the Moon. A door opened across the street. A woman came out of the general store broad-shouldered and direct in the way of someone who had not changed her manner for anyone in 30 years. She had gray hair pinned up without ceremony and an apron that had seen serious use. She looked at Margaret the way a person looks at something they are already deciding what to do about. "You the one who just came out of Aldridge's office?" she said. "I am." "You look like you need coffee." "I need lodging," Margaret said. "I have money to pay for it. Not much, but enough for a week while I determine my next steps." The woman studied her. "Ruth Beaumont. I run the store and the post office and the only boarding house in Clearwater that doesn't have fleas." She tilted her head toward the store. "Come inside before you freeze." Margaret picked up her trunk. "Leave it," Ruth said. "Nobody in this town is going to steal a woman's trunk in broad daylight. Not with me watching." Margaret left the trunk and followed her inside. The store was warm and smelled of coffee and cedar and leather. Ruth set a pot on the small stove behind the counter and pointed at a chair. Margaret sat. She had been awake for 21 hours, and her feet hurt, and she was furious in the specific cold way that only came when she had been treated as though she were stupid. "How much did Aldridge offer you for the train fare home?" Ruth asked. He mentioned it, but did not specify an amount. He offered the last one $40. Ruth poured 2 cups. She took it and left the same afternoon. "The last one?" "You're the 3rd woman he's recruited from back east in 2 years, all of them with legal training or accounting experience, all of them sent home inside a week." Ruth sat down across from her and handed her a cup. "You have any idea what he actually wanted you for?" Margaret wrapped her hands around the cup. She thought about the maps on the wall and the mismatched boundary lines, and the way Bowes had tucked her letter of offer into his coat pocket without giving it back. He wanted someone who could read a land contract and certify the language was sound. Someone with credentials from an established firm. To put their name on documents that weren't sound. Yes. Ruth was quiet for a moment. "You figured that out fast." "I read the maps on his wall." Ruth looked at her with the particular expression of someone revising an estimate upward. "Where are you from?" "Philadelphia. My father was a lawyer. I worked as his senior clerk for 6 years before he died, then for the firm of Aldrich and Moore for 3 years after that. Land law, primarily. Contract verification title, searches, deed authentication." Ruth set down her cup. "Aldridge has been buying up ranch land in this county for 4 years, small spreads mostly, ranchers who borrowed against their land when times were good and can't make payments when times get hard. Half of them signed contracts they didn't fully understand, and by the time they understood, Aldridge had a judge's seal on the paperwork, and they had 30 days to leave. He is the judge." "He is." Ruth's voice was flat. "There's a territorial marshal 2 counties over who's been looking for grounds to investigate, but every document Aldridge files is clean. Too clean maybe for a man doing what people say he's doing. She looked at Margaret steadily. You understand what I'm saying? He needed someone legitimate to certify the documents, Margaret said. Someone with real credentials. Someone whose name would hold up if the marshal's office ever looked closely. And when they said no, or when they started asking the wrong questions, he sent them home with train fare and a polite farewell. And the documents kept getting filed. They did. Margaret drank her coffee. Outside, she could hear the town going on without her boots on boardwalks, a horse blowing, someone hammering something at the far end of the street. Is there work in Clearwater? She asked. Honest work. I can keep books, write correspondence, manage accounts. I learn quickly and I work without complaint. Not much, Ruth said. The town's small. Most people handle their own. What about the ranches outside town? Ruth was quiet again. This time the quiet had a different quality, like she was making a decision. There's one ranch, she said. About 6 miles northeast. Hartwell spread. Elias Hartwell. He's been fighting Aldridge for 2 years over a boundary line on his eastern pasture. Aldridge claims the survey puts 200 acres of Elias's best grazing land inside county reserve territory. Elias says the original deed proves otherwise, but he can't get anyone to look at the language closely enough to make a case. Why not? Because every lawyer in 100 miles either works for Aldridge or is afraid of him. Ruth looked at her. And because Elias is not a man who asks for help easily. But he needs someone who can read the original deed. He needs someone who can read it and explain what it means in terms a court would respect. Ruth picked up her cup. Whether he'd admit that is a different question entirely. Margaret stood. Could you tell me how to get there? Ruth looked at her for a long moment. Then she stood too, went to the window and pointed northeast, past the edge of town, to where a line of fence posts was just visible against the gray sky. Follow those fence posts until you hit a creek crossing, she said. Cross it and go up the rise. You'll see the main house from the top. Thank you, Mrs. Beaumont. Miss. Ruth turned back from the window. And don't thank me yet. Elias Hartwell has turned away 3 people this fall who came out to offer help. He's not what you'd call welcoming. Neither am I, Margaret said, when someone wastes my time. She retrieved her trunk from in front of the land office. Harlan Bowes watched her from the window as she lifted it. She did not look at him. She walked northeast along the fence line with her trunk in one hand and her carpet bag in the other, and the wind coming off the mountains like a wall. She found the creek crossing. She crossed it. She went up the rise. She saw the house. It was a working ranch, in the way that working meant something not prosperous, not struggling, but holding on with the particular stubbornness of something that had been built right and maintained with discipline. 2 men were repairing a section of fence along the near pasture. One was older, walking with a pronounced limp. The other was tall, with dark hair, and the kind of posture that came from years of physical work, and he stopped what he was doing when he saw her coming up the road. He walked to meet her at the gate. He was lean and weathered, and his eyes were dark brown and direct, and he did not look like a man who had time for surprises. This is private property, he said, not rudely, just factually. I know, Margaret said. My name is Margaret Calloway. I came from Philadelphia to take a position with the county land office. The position turned out to be fraudulent. I have legal training and $11, and I need work. Mrs. Beaumont at the general store told me you have a problem with a deed. He looked at her for a moment. Ruth Beaumont sent you out here. She pointed me in this direction. I came on my own. He crossed his arms. What kind of legal training? 6 years as senior clerk to my father, who was a practicing land attorney. 3 years at Aldrich and Moore in Philadelphia, doing title searches and contract verification. I can read an original land deed in Spanish, English, or French, depending on the territory of origin, identify alterations in handwriting or ink age, and explain the legal implications of ambiguous boundary language in terms plain enough for a territorial judge to follow. She paused, assuming the judge is not also the person who altered the document. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile. More like a door opening a fraction. "You know who Aldridge is," he said. "I spent approximately 45 minutes in his office this morning. That was sufficient." He looked at her trunk, then at her face. He had the expression of a man doing arithmetic he hadn't expected to be doing. "Chester," he called back toward the fence line. The older man with the limp looked up. "Come take Miss Calloway's trunk to the house." Chester came over, took the trunk from Margaret without comment, and carried it toward the porch with the uncomplaining efficiency of someone who had been doing whatever needed doing for a long time. Elias Hartwell held the gate open. "I'm not promising anything," he said. "I'll show you the deed and you can tell me what you see. If you can actually help, we'll talk about terms. If you can't, I'll pay you for your time, and Chester will drive you back to town." "That's fair," Margaret said. "And Miss Calloway." He looked at her with those direct dark eyes. "I've had 2 lawyers and a surveyor tell me my deed doesn't say what I know it says. If you're going to tell me the same thing, I'd rather know now before either of us wastes an afternoon." "Mr. Hartwell," she said, stepping through the gate. "In my experience, when 3 different experts tell a man his document doesn't say what he knows, it says there are 2 possibilities. Either the man is wrong or the experts were paid to read it wrong." She stopped beside him. "I wasn't paid by anyone yet, so I have no reason to read it incorrectly." He looked at her for one more moment. Then he turned toward the house. "Coffee's on," he said. "Follow me." The deed was in a locked box under the floorboard of his study wrapped in oilcloth, which meant Elias Hartwell knew exactly how important it was and had been protecting it accordingly. He laid it on the desk and stepped back and watched her the way a man watches a doctor, examining something he is afraid to hear the verdict on. Margaret put on her reading glasses. She leaned over the desk. The document was dated 1863, filed in the Territorial Registry of Wyoming, under the original Homestead Act provisions, signed by Elias's grandfather, Harold James Hartwell, and countersigned by a territorial registrar, whose signature she didn't recognize. The language was standard for the period. The boundary descriptions ran north to the creek, east to the survey marker at what was designated as the Old Harding Post, south along the natural ridge line, and west to the county road. She read it twice. Then she looked up. "When did Aldridge file the claim that your eastern pasture falls within county reserve territory?" she asked. 14 months ago." "On what basis?" "He produced a survey map that puts the Harding Post 200 yards further west than where it actually stands. His surveyor certified the map." "Do you have the original survey documentation for the Harding Post placement?" Elias opened a drawer and produced a second document. Margaret read it. She set it beside the deed. She looked at both of them together for a long time. "Mr. Hartwell," she said carefully. "What?" "The boundary language in your deed references the Harding Post as located at the intersection of what was then called the North Fork Tributary and the county road. That's a fixed geographic point. 2 features that cannot be moved." She tapped the deed. "Your deed doesn't rely on the survey marker alone. It relies on a physical intersection of natural and constructed features." She looked up at him. "Aldridge's surveyor moved the marker on paper, but he cannot move the creek." Elias was very still. "Say that again," he said quietly. "Your boundary is legally defined by the point where the North Fork tributary meets the county road. That point exists in the physical world, regardless of where any survey marker is placed or replaced. Aldridge's map moves the marker, but your deed doesn't reference only the marker. It references the intersection." She straightened up. "Any court looking at the original deed language against a physical survey of the creek and road intersection would find that your eastern boundary is exactly where you say it is." Elias put both hands flat on the desk. He stared at the documents. When he looked up at her, there was something in his face that she recognized, the particular expression of a person who has been told repeatedly that they are wrong about something they knew was right. 3 people told me I was reading it wrong," he said. 3 people told you something that is not consistent with the plain language of the document, she said. That is not the same thing. The silence between them lasted a good while. Outside, Chester was saying something to the younger ranch hand Billy, whose voice carried through the walls with the particular enthusiasm of someone who hadn't yet learned to modulate indoor and outdoor volume. "Miss Calloway," Elias said. "Yes." "What would it take to make this case in front of the territorial marshal? A formal affidavit documenting the deed language of physical survey of the creek and road intersection conducted by a registered surveyor not affiliated with Aldridge, and someone qualified to interpret the legal language before the marshal's office." She paused. "Aldridge will fight it. He will produce counter-documentation. He may produce witnesses." "I know. It could take months. He has more money than you, and he has the local judiciary." "I know that too." She looked at him steadily. "Why haven't you left 14 months of fighting a corrupt judge with no lawyer willing to take your case? Most men would have taken whatever he offered and moved on." Elias looked at the oilcloth-wrapped deed sitting on his desk. "My grandfather filed that claim in 1863, he said. "He broke this land with his hands. My father ran cattle on it for 20 years, before the drought years broke him financially, and he had to borrow against it. I paid off every cent of that debt in 9 years. He looked back at her. "I am not giving 200 acres of my grandfather's land to a man who moves survey markers on paper and calls it law." Margaret picked up her glasses and folded them into her satchel. "My rate is $10 a month," she said. "Room and board included. I will require full access to all documents you have related to the property, the deed history, the original filing, and anything you have received from Aldridge's office. I will need to visit the county road and creek intersection with a measuring chain and a surveyor's compass, which I know how to use. And I will need your complete honesty if there is anything in the property history that complicates the claim." Elias straightened. "There's one thing," he said. "Tell me." "The note on the property. I borrowed against the land 7 years ago when we had a bad cattle year. The note is held by Aldridge's bank." Margaret absorbed this. "How current are the payments?" "Current. Never missed one." His jaw was tight. "But the note gives him leverage. If I make trouble for him over the boundary claim, he could find a reason to call it early." "How much is outstanding?" $2,200. She was quiet for a moment. "That's the real weapon," she said. "Not the boundary dispute. He can lose the boundary dispute and still take the ranch if he calls the note and you can't pay." "Yes." "Did you know that when you decided to fight him?" Elias held her gaze. "Yes." She looked at him for a moment. A man who knew exactly the risk he was taking and had decided to take it anyway. She understood that. She had walked 6 miles in the cold carrying a trunk because the alternative was getting on a train home with $40 of a corrupt judge's money in her pocket. "All right," she said. "I'll need to see everything, every document, every letter, every communication from Aldridge's office. I'll get them tonight." She nodded. She turned toward the door, then stopped. "Mr. Hartwell." "Elias." She paused at that, then accepted it. "Elias, I need you to understand something clearly. I am not a lawyer. I cannot represent you in court. What I can do is build a case so thoroughly documented and legally precise that any qualified attorney or the marshal's office directly cannot ignore it. I can make your evidence impossible to dismiss." She looked at him. "But to do that, I need you to trust my reading of these documents, even when it conflicts with what you've been told by other people." "You already proved I should." "I proved it once on one deed. That's not the same as a blanket trust." He considered that. "No," he said. "But it's a start." Something about the way he said it, not easily, not as a pleasantry, but as if he had weighed the word before he used it, made her feel for the first time since she had stepped off the stagecoach that morning that she was standing on solid ground. "Chester will show you to the spare room," he said. "Supper's at 6. My men are rough, but they're decent." "I've handled rough," she said. He almost smiled at that. It was the kind of almost smile that lived in the corners of a man's eyes rather than his mouth, and it disappeared quickly, but she caught it. "I believe you," he said. She followed Chester up the stairs, and behind her, she could hear Elias opening another drawer, already pulling documents, already beginning the work that would either save his ranch or bring everything down on both of them before spring. She was not afraid. She had $11, her father's satchel, a legitimate reading of a land deed, and now, for the first time in longer than she could properly remember, a problem worth solving. That was enough to start. Supper at the Hartwell Ranch was not a quiet affair, but it was an honest one. Chester Dade sat at the table with the careful posture of a man who had learned long ago that his body would hurt regardless of how he held it, so he might as well hold it with dignity. Billy Oakes sat across from him and talked without pausing, between thoughts apparently operating under the belief that silence was something that happened to other people. A third hand, a quiet young man named Samuel, who had arrived at the ranch 2 seasons ago and never offered any explanation for where he'd come from, ate steadily and said nothing at all. Elias sat at the head of the table. He had washed and changed his shirt, but not his expression, which was the expression of a man carrying a weight he had gotten so used to that he had forgotten what it felt like to set it down. Margaret sat where Chester pointed her, which was at the far end, which suited her. She could see everyone from there. "You're a lawyer," Billy said, before she had finished her first spoonful of the stew Chester had made, which was simple and hot and needed salt. "I am not a lawyer," Margaret said. "I am a legal clerk. There is a difference." "What's the difference?" "A lawyer can argue a case in court. A clerk builds the case so that arguing it becomes unavoidable." She reached for the salt. "The lawyer gets the credit. The clerk does the work." Billy considered this with the open-faced seriousness of someone encountering a concept for the first time. "That doesn't seem fair." "It isn't," Margaret said. "But it is accurate." Chester made a sound that might have been a laugh quickly suppressed. Elias said nothing. He was looking at his plate, but she could tell from the slight tension across his shoulders that he was listening to every word. "How long were you doing that?" Billy asked. "The clerk work. 9 years. "For who?" "My father until he died. Then for his firm until they decided a woman without a father's name to justify her presence was more trouble than she was worth." She said it without bitterness, the way you say something that stopped hurting years ago, but left a mark. "I was 23 when I started. I was reading deed abstracts before that in my father's study because there was nothing else to read, and he never thought to tell me I shouldn't." "Where's your father buried?" Chester asked. It was the first full sentence he'd spoken since supper started, and the directness of it might have startled her if she hadn't spent enough time around older men who treated condolence as a practical matter. "Philadelphia," she said. "St. Michael's Churchyard, next to my mother." Chester nodded, as if that answered something. Billy opened his mouth again. "Eat your supper, Billy," Elias said. Billy ate his supper. After the meal, Chester cleared without being asked, and Samuel disappeared in the direction of the bunkhouse. Billy lingered for approximately 4 seconds before Elias looked at him, and he remembered somewhere else he needed to be. Margaret helped Chester with the dishes. He didn't tell her to stop, which she took as acceptance. "How long have you been here?" she asked him. 12 years. He handed her a plate to dry. "Came on when Elias's father was still running the place. Bad year. They needed an extra hand, and I needed work, and nobody else was offering any, so it worked out." "Why wouldn't anyone else offer work?" Chester was quiet for a moment. "Gettysburg," he said finally. "Took half my leg and all of the parts of a man that make other men comfortable around him. Some people look at a damaged thing and see a liability." He handed her another plate. "Elias looked at me and asked if I could still ride." "Could you?" "Well enough." The corner of his mouth moved. He said well enough was sufficient. Margaret dried the plate and set it on the shelf where it belonged. From the study down the hall, she could hear the sound of a drawer opening. Then papers. Then silence. Elias was working. "He's going to fight this to the end," she said. It wasn't a question. Chester handed her the last bowl. He's been fighting it since before you got here. He'll be fighting it after. The only thing that's changed is now maybe he's got something to fight with. He looked at her steadily. Don't give him a weapon and then tell him he can't use it, Miss Calloway. That's worse than no weapon at all. She understood what he was telling her. She took it seriously. She went down the hall and knocked on the study door. Come in, Elias said. He had the documents spread across the desk in 3 groups. She could see immediately that he had organized them chronologically, which told her something about how his mind worked. She pulled the chair to the side of the desk rather than sitting across from him, because across from him was an adversarial position, and she was not his adversary. Show me what you have, she said. He did. They worked for 2 hours. He would hand her a document, and she would read it and tell him what it said. Not just what the words meant, but what the words did, how they created obligations, how they defined boundaries, where they were vulnerable and where they were strong. He asked questions that were direct and specific, never wasting words, and she answered them the same way. And somewhere in the 2nd hour, the careful distance that had been between them at supper began to close. Not because of anything either of them did deliberately, but because serious work done honestly between 2 people who both know what they're doing has a way of burning off pretense. This letter, she said, holding up a page, from Aldridge's office, dated 8 months ago. He's offering you $1,500 for voluntary surrender of the disputed parcel. I know what it says. Do you know what it tells us? Elias leaned back slightly. Tell me. He offered you money. A man with a legally airtight case does not offer money. He goes to court and wins. She set the letter down. This letter is Aldridge telling us in writing that he is not confident his case would survive a real legal challenge. He was hoping you'd take the money and make the problem go away. Elias looked at the letter. I burned his reply in that fireplace. What did you say in it? I said no. You didn't say anything else? I said no, and I said why. And I may have used some language that wouldn't be appropriate in present company. Margaret looked at him. He met her eyes without apology. Fair enough, she said. He sent Dylan out here the week after, Elias said. His voice had changed slightly, flatter, more careful. His son, with 2 men I didn't recognize. They didn't come to the house. They rode the fence line on the eastern pasture for about an hour, then left. Intimidation. That's what I thought. Did anything happen to the fence after that? Elias was quiet for a moment. 3 posts pulled and a section of wire cut 2 weeks later. Could have been anything. Could have been the weather or the cattle. I fixed it and didn't say anything because I had no proof. Margaret wrote something in the small notebook she'd pulled from her satchel. What are you writing? He asked. A timeline. Every contact from Aldridge's office, every incident on the property, every document exchange, in order. She kept writing. If we ever stand in front of a marshal, the pattern matters as much as any individual document. A corrupt boundary claim and a letter offering to buy you out and fence posts pulled 3 weeks later separately, each one can be explained. Together, they tell a story. Elias watched her write. She could feel him watching the way you feel a tension that is trying to be unobtrusive and not quite managing it. You learned this from your father, he asked. He used to say that individual facts are ammunition and patterns are artillery. She finished the entry and looked up. He was a good lawyer. He was not a good businessman, which is why I ended up on a stagecoach to Wyoming instead of in a comfortable position in Philadelphia, but that's a different conversation. You don't have to tell me about it. I know I don't. She turned a page in the notebook. Aldridge recruited me specifically, didn't he? He didn't just put out a general advertisement. Elias frowned slightly. What makes you think that? Ruth Beaumont told me I'm the 3rd woman with legal training he's brought out here in 2 years. All sent home quickly. He's not advertising blindly. He's identifying people with specific credentials and making specific offers. Which means someone told him about me, or he saw my name on a case filing at Aldrich and Moore and decided I was useful. She tapped the pen against the notebook. I would like to know which. Why does it matter? Because if he researched me specifically, he knows more about my history than I'm comfortable with. And if I'm going to help you build a case against him, I need to know if he has any leverage over me that he might use. She said it plainly without embarrassment. I have no financial holdings, no property, no family obligations. My father's debts were settled before I left Philadelphia. There is nothing he can threaten me with materially. She paused. But I would rather know that for certain than assume it. Elias was quiet for a moment. You're not what I expected, he said. What did you expect? Someone who'd look at the deed and tell me what I wanted to hear so they could collect the $10 a month without the trouble of actually solving anything. The 3 people who told you the deed didn't say what you knew it said, she replied. Were they telling you what Aldrich wanted to hear, or what was easier to say? Both, I suspect. Then you understand why I'm not going to do the same thing in the other direction. If I find something in these documents that hurts your case, I'll tell you. She met his eyes. You need someone who reads accurately, not someone who reads loyally. Loyalty to a wrong conclusion is just a slower way of losing. He held her gaze for a moment. All right, he said. It had the same weight it had carried that afternoon at the gate, not casual agreement, something more deliberate. She went back to the documents. It was past 10 o'clock when she found it. She almost missed it. It was in the 3rd group of papers, a letter from the county registrar's office dated 3 years ago, acknowledging receipt of a boundary amendment filing. The letter itself was routine, but it referenced a document number, and that document number did not match any filing in the stack of papers Elias had shown her. There's a document missing, she said. Elias looked up from the account book he had been reviewing while she read. What document? She held up the letter and pointed to the reference number. The county registrar sent you this letter 3 years ago, confirming receipt of a boundary amendment filing, but you don't have the original amendment document in your records. She looked at him. Did you file a boundary amendment 3 years ago? No. She turned the letter over, read it again. Then someone filed one in your name. The silence in the room was sudden and complete. That's not possible, Elias said. You need the original deed and a notarized statement from the property owner. Or a very convincing forgery of both. She set the letter down flat on the desk between them. This letter was sent to you 3 years ago. Did you read it when it arrived? He was already reaching for it. He read it. She watched his face change as he read it, not dramatically, not with the kind of expression that made itself obvious, but with the specific stillness of a person realizing that what they're looking at reshapes something they thought they understood. I thought it was a confirmation of the original deed registration, he said. I filed it and didn't look at it again. Because the language is designed to look routine. She pointed at the wording. Look at the phrase, boundary amendment filing received and processed per your submission. If you weren't reading carefully, if you weren't specifically looking for the word amendment, you'd file it as general correspondence. She looked at him. Someone counted on that. Aldrich filed a fake boundary amendment in my name 3 years ago, Elias said. Not a question. He was working through it. Before he ever approached you about the disputed parcel, Margaret said. He set the legal foundation first, then came to you with the survey dispute. But if there's a boundary amendment on record in your name, even a forged one, it complicates your deed claim substantially. Because the court will see an amendment that appears to have your authorization, and then your deed, and the amendment is more recent. He amended my own boundary against me, and sent you the confirmation letter so it would be in your files looking legitimate, in case you ever went looking. She kept her voice steady. It was important right now that her voice stay steady. This is actually important, Elias. I know it doesn't feel that way right now, but this is the most significant thing in this stack of papers. How is this important? It means he's been setting this up for 3 years. It means he committed forgery, not just a questionable survey or a disputed boundary line. Document forgery. That is a criminal matter, not a civil one. If we can demonstrate that the boundary amendment filing is forged through handwriting analysis, through the notary seal, through the document number itself, which may be traceable in the county records, we go from a property dispute that Aldridge can manage locally to a federal forgery charge that the territorial marshal cannot ignore, regardless of what pressure Aldridge applies. Elias was very still. "Can you prove it's forged?" he asked. "I can build the case that it should be investigated as a forgery. The actual proof requires comparing the document itself with the county registry records, which are in Clearwater, and getting a handwriting expert to examine the notary signature, which will require time and resources." She looked at him levelly. "But I can write the affidavit. I can document exactly what is anomalous about this letter and what a legitimate boundary amendment process would have required, and I can explain clearly why the absence of your knowledge or authorization constitutes evidence of fraud." She paused. "That gives us something to take to the marshal, something concrete and criminal. And it gives Aldridge a reason to move faster against us." "Yes," she said. "It does." She did not apologize for that. There was no honest way to soften it, so she didn't try. Elias stood up. He walked to the window and back, not pacing, exactly, more like a man reminding himself that the room still had solid walls, that things were still in the places he had put them. Then he stopped. "When can you write the affidavit?" he said. "Tomorrow morning. I need to review the county records first to confirm the document number anomaly, which means a trip to the registrar's office in town." She thought about Harlan Bowes and his sideways eyes. "I'll need to go alone. If you come with me, Aldridge will know immediately what we're looking for." "I don't like the idea of you going into that office alone." "I've already been in that office once today and walked out with more information than I came in with." She closed her notebook. "I'm less conspicuous than you are. I'm a woman who was just offered a job and didn't take it. If I go to the registrar's office asking to verify a document number for my personal records, it looks like I'm covering myself legally before leaving town. It won't raise the same alarm." He didn't like it. She could see that clearly. But she could also see him thinking it through and arriving at the same conclusion she had. "Be careful," he said. "I am always careful," she replied. "It's efficient." She gathered the documents back into their groups precisely as he'd had them and stood. "One more thing," she said at the door. "What?" "The note on the property. The $2,200 outstanding to Aldridge's bank." She turned to face him. "I need the full loan document. Original terms, payment history, every amendment or modification. All of it." "Why?" "Because if he forged a boundary amendment, he's capable of altering a loan document. And I want to know before he tries to call that note exactly what it says and exactly what it should say." She held his gaze. "I want to know his weapons before he uses them." Elias looked at her for a moment. The lamplight made the angles of his face harder than they were, and the shadows under his eyes told her he hadn't been sleeping well in a long time, which was the natural consequence of fighting a battle alone that was never designed to be fought alone. "I'll have it on the desk by morning," he said. "Thank you." She opened the door. "Good night, Elias." "Good night, Miss Calloway." She paused. "Margaret," she said, and went upstairs. She lay in the dark of the spare room and listened to the wind coming off the mountains and the distant sound of cattle, and she thought about the forged document and what it meant about the scope of what Aldridge had been doing, not just to Elias, but to every small rancher he had moved against in 4 years. She thought about the other women he had recruited and sent home with train fare. She thought about how precisely the trap had been laid and how long it had been lying there waiting. She thought about Elias Hartwell, who had known the risk and decided to take it anyway, and had somehow not broken under the weight of fighting it alone. She thought about Chester's voice saying, "Don't give him a weapon, and then tell him he can't use it." She was not going to do that. She turned on her side and closed her eyes, and she thought about the document number in the registrar's letter and the specific way forged notary seals caught the light differently from genuine ones, a thing her father had shown her once on a contested estate case when she was 17 years old, and she had never forgotten it, because he had said, "Margaret, a lie always leaves a physical trace. You just have to know where to look." She knew where to look. She slept. Margaret was at the registrar's office when it opened at 8 o'clock in the morning. Harlan Bowes was not there yet. The clerk who unlocked the door was a young man named Thomas, who had the slightly dazed expression of someone who had not been expecting anyone to be waiting on the steps at 7:55 on a cold November morning. He was perhaps 20 years old, and he had not yet learned to be careful, which suited Margaret perfectly. "Good morning," she said. "I was hoping to verify a document number for my personal records. I received a letter last year from this office, and I want to make sure my filing copy matches what's on record. It will only take a moment." Thomas let her in without hesitation. The county registry ledgers were kept in a wooden cabinet behind the front desk, organized by year and by filing type. Thomas pulled the ledger for the year indicated on the letter 3 years prior and laid it open on the counter. Margaret ran her finger down the columns. The document number from Aldridge's letter appeared on the 4th page. Property Boundary Amendment. Hartwell Parcel Section 14 Range 7. Filed November 3rd. Notarized by one J.P. Kramer County Notary. She kept her expression neutral. "Thank you," she said, writing the entry into her notebook. "Could you tell me who J.P. Kramer is? I want to make sure the notary is still active in case I need to follow up." Thomas thought about it. "I don't think we have a J.P. Kramer on the county notary roll. Let me check." He pulled a second ledger thinner and bound in red. He looked. He looked again. "I don't see that name." "That's odd," Margaret said pleasantly. "Perhaps he was a temporary appointment." "Maybe." Thomas looked uncertain. "I can ask Mr. Bowes when he comes in." "That's all right," she said. "I have what I need. Thank you for your help." She walked out of the registrar's office at 8:14, and by 8:20, she was sitting in Ruth Beaumont's store, with her notebook open on the counter, and Ruth standing across from her, with both arms crossed, and an expression of focused attention. "The notary on the forged amendment doesn't exist," Margaret said. "His name is not on the county notary roll for that year, or any year. Aldridge, or someone working for him, invented a notary, stamped a seal they had made, and filed a document amending Elias's boundary in Elias's name without Elias's knowledge." Ruth was quiet for a moment. How hard is that to do? Easier than it should be, in a county where the justice of the peace is also the largest property owner. Margaret turned a page in her notebook. The notary seal is the key. Every legitimate notary seal is registered with the Territorial Secretary of State's office. If J.P. Kramer's seal is not on that registry, the document is unambiguously fraudulent. That is not a matter of interpretation or competing surveys. It is a verifiable legal fact. And if Aldridge finds out you pulled that ledger this morning, then we need to move faster than he does. Margaret closed the notebook. "I need to write 2 things today: the affidavit documenting the forgery evidence, and a letter to the Territorial Marshal's office in Cheyenne. The affidavit needs to be precise enough that a marshal can act on it without needing additional legal counsel. The letter needs to be compelling enough that it doesn't sit on a desk for 3 weeks. You know how to write both of those things?" "Yes." Ruth looked at her steadily. "What do you need from me?" "Paper, a witness signature on the affidavit, and your honest assessment of whether the marshal in Cheyenne is a man who can be moved by evidence or a man who can be moved by Aldridge's money." "Marshal Cade Rourke," Ruth said without hesitating. "He's been trying to build a case against Aldridge for 2 years. He's honest and he's frustrated, and he will read every word of what you write." She went to the back of the store and came back with a sheaf of paper and a bottle of ink. "He came through Clearwater 4 months ago asking questions about the Patterson Ranch sale. Aldridge ran him out of the county inside 48 hours by filing a judicial complaint about interference in a civil property matter. "He'll be receptive to a criminal forgery complaint," Margaret said. "A civil property dispute is within Aldridge's jurisdiction as justice of the peace. A forgery charge is not. It removes him from his own courtroom." "Sit down," Ruth said. "Right. I'll keep the door." Margaret sat down and wrote. She wrote for 3 hours without stopping, the kind of sustained, concentrated work that her father had called the most honest labor a person could do, because there was no way to pretend your way through a legal affidavit. Either the logic held, or it didn't. Either the evidence supported the claim, or it didn't. She laid out the timeline she had built the night before, the boundary amendment. Filing the non-existent notary, the letter Aldridge had sent that was designed to look routine. The offer to buy the disputed parcel, the fence posts, and the way each element fit against the others to form a pattern that had only one coherent explanation. She was finishing the letter to Marshal Rourke when the door opened. It was not a customer. Dylan Aldridge was not quite as large as she had imagined him from Elias's description, but he carried his size differently from most men, loosely, carelessly, the way someone carries something they know they can put down hard if they need to. He was perhaps 30 with his father's coloring and none of his father's restraint. He looked at Margaret the way men look at things they haven't decided yet whether to take seriously. "Miss Calloway," he said, "thought I might find you here." Ruth had moved to the end of the counter without appearing to move anywhere. Her hand rested near the shelf where Margaret happened to know from the morning's conversation that Ruth kept a short-barreled shotgun. "Mr. Aldridge," Margaret said. She did not put down her pen. "Can I help you? My father wanted me to check on you. Make sure you weren't having trouble finding your way back to the stage depot." He smiled. It was a smile that had probably worked on a certain kind of person. "Stage to Cheyenne leaves day after tomorrow. Plenty of time to get your things together." "That's thoughtful. I'm not leaving, but thank you." The smile stayed on his face but lost its warmth, which made it worse. "Miss Calloway, you've been here one day. You don't know this town." "I know enough of it." She turned back to her letter. "The Hartwell Ranch is not a place for a woman on her own. There's been trouble out there. Rustlers' fence cutting all kinds of accidents. Dangerous country for someone who doesn't know it." He stepped closer to the counter. "My father is a reasonable man. He's prepared to offer you the same terms he offered the other ladies he brought out here. $40 and a fair sending off. No hard feelings." Margaret set down the pen and looked at him directly. "Tell me something," she said. "The other 2 women he brought out here, the ones who took the $40 and left, do you know what they would have found if they'd stayed and looked at the county ledgers?" Dylan's expression shifted. Something moved behind his eyes, not quite fear, but the alertness of someone who just realized the ground was less solid than they thought. "Because I found it in one morning," Margaret continued, "which suggests that the problem is not hard to find. It's just that most people who get close to it take the $40 instead." She held his gaze. "I don't want $40, Mr. Aldridge. I want the J.P. Kramer notary seal registration from the Territorial Secretary's office. And I suspect when I write to request it, I'm going to find that J.P. Kramer does not exist." The silence in the room had a quality she recognized from her father's courtroom days. The quality of something irrevocable being said out loud. Dylan's jaw tightened. "You're making a mistake. People keep telling me that," she said. "None of them have been right yet." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Ruth, who looked back at him with the expression of a woman who had been in this county her entire life and did not frighten easily. He turned and walked out. The door swung shut behind him. Ruth waited until the sound of his horse faded. Then she let out a breath. "He's going straight to his father," she said. "I know." Margaret picked up the pen. "How long do we have before Aldridge moves?" "Hours, maybe, not days." Ruth came back to the counter. "What do you need to do before then?" "Finish this letter. Get it in the mail pouch on today's outgoing coach." She wrote faster. "And then I need to get back to the ranch and tell Elias that we likely have less time than we thought." "The stage pouch goes at noon," Ruth said. "You have 2 hours." Margaret wrote. Ruth locked the front door and turned the sign and stood with her arms crossed and her eyes on the window. And the two of them worked in their separate ways through the quiet of the store, while the November wind moved outside and the clock on the wall measured the distance between what they had and what was coming. She finished at 11:40. Ruth read both documents. She read them carefully the way a person reads something they are about to put their name on, and when she looked up, her expression had changed in a way that was hard to define precisely, something between respect and a kind of sober recognition. "This is very good," she said quietly. "It's accurate," Margaret said. "That's what matters." Ruth signed as witness. She sealed the letter to Marshal Rourke herself and walked it to the mail pouch personally, and she came back and put her hand briefly on Margaret's shoulder, a gesture so direct and uncomplicated that it made something tighten unexpectedly in Margaret's chest. "Ride back to the ranch," Ruth said. "And Margaret." She said it with the ease of someone who had decided on first-name terms and wasn't going to explain it. "Don't ride alone." She didn't. Billy Oakes had come into town that morning for supplies and was tying his horse in front of the store when she came out, which meant either it was fortunate timing or Elias had arranged it, and she suspected the latter and found she didn't mind. Billy talked the entire 6 miles back. She let him because his voice was a reasonable thing to put between herself and the cold clarity of what she was carrying. The certain knowledge that she had made herself visible today in a way that could not be undone. That Dylan Aldridge had looked her in the face and understood exactly what she was doing, and that Victor Aldridge would respond. The question was how and how fast. She had her answer before she reached the house. Elias was standing on the porch when they rode up. She knew from his posture, from the particular stillness of him, that something had happened while she was in town. Chester was beside him, and Samuel stood at the corner of the porch holding his hat. "What is it?" she said before she had fully dismounted. Elias came down the steps and handed her a document. It was a letter from the Aldridge Territorial Bank, addressed to Elias Hartwell, dated that morning. The language was formal and precise, and every word of it was designed to sound legal and inevitable. Due to material changes in the assessed risk profile of the collateral property and pursuant to Section 7 of the loan agreement dated March 1871, the bank exercises its right to call the outstanding loan balance of $2,200 payable in full within 30 days of this notice. Margaret read it twice. She turned it over looking for any amendment to the standard terms. She found none. "He moved faster than I expected," she said. "Someone from the bank rode out this morning while you were in town, handed it to Chester and left without stopping." 30 days, she said. "I don't have $2,200, Elias said. "Not within 30 days, not within 60. "I know." She was still looking at the letter. "He's doing this because of this morning. Dylan came to find me in town, which means Bose told them I pulled the registry ledger. They know I found the amendment filing." She turned toward the house. "Come inside. I need to look at the loan document." "I told you last night I'd have it on the desk." "I know you did." The loan document was on the desk in the study, exactly as he'd promised, and she sat down and read it carefully from the first line to the last. The terms were standard for the period and the territory. The Section 7 he had invoked was real, and the language was clear. The bank had the right to call the balance upon material changes to the collateral value. "Has the assessed value of the ranch changed?" she asked. "Not officially. There's been no new assessment." "Then what material changes is he claiming?" "He doesn't specify. He doesn't have to under the contract language." Elias was standing by the desk with his arms at his sides, and she could see the effort it was taking him to stand still, to not give way to the anger that was visible in every line of him. "He wrote the contract terms himself. His lawyer drafted the agreement. I had no one to review it." Margaret set the document down flat and pressed her palms against the desk and looked at the ceiling for exactly 2 seconds, which was the amount of time she permitted herself when she needed to think without speaking. Then she looked at him. The Section 7 invocation is legally valid under the contract language, she said. I'm not going to tell you otherwise. He has the right under what you signed. Elias nodded once. He had known this already. He was waiting for what came after it. However, she said, the contract was signed 7 years ago. The collateral was assessed at that time. If he is claiming a material change in collateral value, he is required to substantiate that claim with an actual assessment. He can't simply declare a change without evidence. She tapped the document. If you challenge the invocation formally, not the contract itself, but the specific application of Section 7, he has to produce an assessment report. And if he hasn't conducted one, the invocation may not be enforceable. That buys time. It buys time, she agreed. Which is what we need. The letter to Marshal Rourke goes out today's coach. The Marshal's office will receive it in 3 to 4 days. If Rourke responds as Ruth says he will, we may have a federal inquiry opened within 2 weeks. And if he doesn't respond quickly enough, she held his gaze, then we need $2,200. The room was quiet except for the wind. I don't have it, Elias said. He said it the way a man says something that costs him flatly without drama, but with the weight of what it means behind it. I know. She picked up her pen. I'm going to write a formal response to the Section 7 invocation tonight, challenging the substantiation of the material change claim and requesting the assessment report. That gives you a legal basis to dispute the timeline without defaulting on the loan. She looked at the pages in front of her. That's tonight's work. What was this morning's work? He asked. The question was not accusatory. He was asking because he wanted to know what had happened in town, and he deserved to know. So she told him. The registry ledger and the non-existent notary. The letter to Marshal Rourke sealed and sent. Dylan Aldridge in Ruth's store, and what she had said to him, and why. When she finished, he was very still. You told him you'd found the notary discrepancy, he said. Yes. You knew that would trigger a response. Yes. He looked at her steadily. Why did you push it that far today? You could have gone back to the ledger later. Gathered more evidence, built the case longer before showing your hand. Because he'd already sent Bose to watch who was pulling ledgers, she said. If I had pulled that ledger and left quietly, they'd have known what I was looking for without knowing what I found. That's a worse position. Better for him to know I found it and know exactly why he should be frightened. She paused. And because I knew this response was coming regardless, the moment Bose saw me walk into that office this morning, the 30-day notice was already being written. All I did was make sure they knew the cost of sending it. Elias was quiet for a long time. She let him be quiet. Outside, Billy was talking to Chester about something, and the sound of it came through the walls, normal, ordinary, the texture of the day, continuing around the thing that was happening inside this room. Maggie, he said. She looked up. It was the first time he'd shortened her name, and he said it without appearing to notice he'd done it the way something slips out when your defenses are occupied elsewhere. I spent 14 months fighting this man alone, he said. I've had lawyers look at that deed and shrug. I've had the bank threaten me and surveyors lie to my face, and I've stood here holding this ranch together with both hands, while everyone in this county waited for me to fail. He looked at her with those steady dark eyes. You've been here 1 day, and you've done more damage to Aldridge's case than I've managed in 14 months. I need you to know that I understand what you've risked to do that. She held his gaze. I risked a job I no longer have and $40 I didn't take, she said. You're risking everything your grandfather built. That's not what I mean. He wasn't quite looking away and wasn't quite not. I mean, I understand it personally, what it costs to go into a room where someone has more power than you and say the thing they don't want you to say anyway. He picked up the bank's letter. That costs something. She was quiet for a moment. My father used to say that the only honest response to injustice is specificity, she said finally. Not anger, not speeches. The specific facts in order with the evidence attached. She looked at the desk, at the organized stacks of documents, at the work that was still ahead of them. Aldridge has been operating on the assumption that no one would be specific enough, persistent enough, or knowledgeable enough to dismantle what he built. I intend to be all three. Elias set down the bank's letter. Then let's get back to work, he said. Chester knocked at the study door at 6 o'clock and announced supper with the brevity of a man who believed announcements should be statements of fact and not invitations for discussion. Margaret set down her pen and flexed her fingers and followed Elias down the hall and at the table. Billy asked what she'd found in town, and she told him the version that was true, without being everything, and she watched him absorb the information with a seriousness that sat oddly but genuinely on his young face. So, he forged a document in Elias's name, Billy said. That is what the evidence indicates. That's a hanging offense. It's a federal criminal charge, she said, which is less dramatic but considerably more useful. Samuel looked up from his plate. It was the first time she'd seen him look directly at anything during a meal. He said, "He's going to come after the ranch before the marshal gets here." It was the most words she'd heard him string together. She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "He is." "Then we'd better be ready," Samuel said, and went back to his supper. Nobody disagreed with him. The table was quiet for a moment. The specific, weighted quiet of people who have heard a true thing, said plainly, and are sitting with the weight of it. And then Chester reached for the bread, and Billy refilled the coffee, and the evening continued. And Margaret looked at the faces of these men around the table and thought about what it meant to fight for something, not because it was certain, not because it was safe, but because it was right and it was theirs, and walking away had never genuinely been an option for any of them. She went back to work after supper. She was still at the desk at midnight when she heard Elias's boots on the stairs slowing as he passed the study door. The door was open. She did not look up. "You should sleep," he said. "I will." A pause. "The Section 7 response," he said. "Will it hold?" "Long enough," she said. "That's what we need." Another pause longer. "Maggie." The name again quiet, and this time she thought he knew he was saying it. "Whatever happens with the marshal, with the note, with all of it." He stopped. She looked up then. He was standing in the doorway with his hand on the frame, and whatever he had been about to say, he folded it back and said instead, "Thank you for today." She held his gaze for a moment. "Go to sleep, Elias," she said. "Tomorrow is going to be harder than today." He almost smiled. She was beginning to recognize the specific shape of his almost smiles, the way they lived briefly in the corner of his right eye before his face remembered its discipline. He went upstairs. She turned back to the document in front of her and wrote until her hand ached, and outside the wind came down off the mountains steady and cold, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called once and went silent, and the lamp burned low, and Margaret Calloway, who had arrived in this territory with $11 and her father's satchel and the certain knowledge that she had been lied to, kept working. She had the truth on her side. She intended to make it count. The formal response to the Section 7 invocation went out on the morning stage, signed by Margaret Calloway, as legal representative, acting on behalf of Elias Hartwell, with a copy sent to the Territorial Attorney General's office in Cheyenne, alongside a separate cover letter she had written at 2 a.m. that explained in precise and measured language why the loan invocation appeared to be retaliatory in nature and potentially coordinated with an ongoing pattern of fraudulent property filings. She had not told Elias about the second letter until breakfast. He had looked at her across the table with an expression she was becoming familiar with, the expression of a man recalibrating something he thought he'd already measured. "The Attorney General," he said. "The Marshal handles criminal matters. The Attorney General handles patterns of abuse of judicial office." She poured coffee. "I want both offices reading their mail on the same morning. I want Aldridge to have 2 simultaneous problems instead of 1 sequential one." Chester made the same sound he'd made at supper the first night, the one that lived in the border territory, between a cough and a laugh. "He's going to know you sent both," Elias said. "Yes," she said. "That's the point." For 2 days after that, nothing happened. It was the kind of nothing that had weight to it, the specific heaviness of a situation holding its breath. Margaret worked through the property documents, methodically building the evidentiary record, with the same careful attention she had given her father's most complex cases. She cross-referenced the boundary amendment, filing against 3 other property transactions Aldridge had recorded in the past 4 years, looking for the same notary name or the same document number sequence, and she found it twice. J.P. Kramer had certified 2 other boundary amendments in the county records, both on properties Aldridge had subsequently acquired, both filed in the names of the original owners, without any evidence those owners had initiated or authorized the filings. She documented everything. She wrote until her fingers cramped, and then she switched to organizing and cross-referencing until she could write again. Elias came in and out of the study without interrupting. He brought coffee without being asked and set it at the corner of the desk where it wouldn't disturb the papers, and she didn't comment on it because commenting on it would have made it a thing and she didn't want it to be a thing. She just drank the coffee and kept working, and she was aware of him the way you are aware of something steady and warm in a cold room, not thinking about it directly, but registering its presence in the background of everything else. On the 3rd day, Nora Finch rode out from town. Margaret heard the horse and came to the window and recognized her from Ruth's description. The school teacher, 35, with the upright posture of someone who had spent years standing in front of a room expecting to be listened to. She dismounted and tied the horse and came up the steps with the direct stride of a woman who had something to say and had decided it needed saying in person. Elias met her on the porch. "Nora," he said. "Elias." She looked at him and then past him to where Margaret had appeared in the doorway. "Miss Calloway, Ruth said I should ride out. There's something you both need to know." They sat at the kitchen table. Chester put coffee on without being asked. Billy made himself scarce with the particular social awareness that he occasionally produced when the situation was serious enough to penetrate his general obliviousness. "Aldridge called a town meeting last night," Nora said. "The church hall. He didn't advertise it widely. I heard about it from the blacksmith who heard it from the feed store. About 30 people attended." "What did he say?" Margaret asked. "He said there's a woman staying at the Hartwell ranch who has been representing herself as a legal professional in order to interfere in legitimate county business. He said she obtained unauthorized access to county records under false pretenses and is working to manufacture a federal case against the county's justice of the peace in order to extort a favorable ruling on a private property dispute." Nora looked at Margaret steadily. "He said you were sent by a Philadelphia law firm that is itself under investigation for fraudulent land dealings in the East, and that your presence here is not coincidence, but a coordinated effort to destabilize property rights in Casper County." The kitchen was quiet. "None of that is true," Margaret said. "I know it isn't," Nora said. "But 30 people heard it last night, and this morning 2 of those people had already repeated it to students' parents, and by noon, half the county will have heard a version of it." She wrapped her hands around her cup. "He's doing to your reputation what he does to property lines. He's filing a false claim and hoping it sits on the record long enough to become accepted fact." Margaret felt something very cold and very clear move through her. This was the move she had been waiting for, not the legal response and not the physical threat, but the social one, the attempt to discredit her before the evidence she had gathered could reach anyone with the authority to act on it. "How many of those 30 people believe him?" she asked. Nora considered it honestly. "Some of them want to. It's easier to believe you're a troublemaker than to believe Victor Aldridge has been committing fraud in their county for 4 years. People don't like being wrong about someone they've trusted." She paused. "But some of them were already uneasy. The Patterson Ranch sale 3 years ago bothered people. The Hendersons leaving last spring bothered people. They've been looking for a reason to say something and not finding one because Aldridge's paperwork is always clean." "It won't be clean much longer," Margaret said. "I found the same false notary on 2 additional property filings. Which means this isn't a dispute between Elias and his neighbor. It's a systematic pattern of fraud conducted under judicial authority. She looked at Nora. The question is whether anyone in this town has the standing and the willingness to say that publicly. Nora met her eyes. What would that require? A statement from someone with local credibility, confirming the pattern of property transfers and the community impact. Not legal testimony that comes later, but a public statement that gives people permission to stop pretending they haven't noticed what's been happening. She paused. Ruth Beaumont would carry weight. So would you. Ruth has already decided, Nora said. I came out here to make my own decision. She was quiet for a moment. I have 17 children in my schoolroom. Half of them are from small ranch families that Aldridge has been pressuring for years. 3 of my students left when their families had to sell and move on. I told myself it was none of my business that I was a teacher and not a legal authority, that there was nothing I could do. She set down her cup. I've been telling myself that for 2 years. I'm tired of it. Margaret held her gaze. Then write what you know. The families who left the circumstances as you witnessed them, the dates and the names, not accusations, observations. What you personally saw and when. She slid a piece of paper across the table. A witness account from a schoolteacher who has lived in this community for 8 years is not nothing, Nora. It is the kind of document that gives a marshal's inquiry a human face. Nora looked at the paper. She picked up the pen. She wrote for 40 minutes at the kitchen table while Margaret reviewed documents beside her, and when she was finished, she handed it across, and Margaret read it and said, "This is good," and meant it, and Nora let out a breath that suggested she had been holding it for considerably longer than the past 40 minutes. Elias walked Nora to her horse when she left. Margaret watched from the porch. "She's braver than she thinks she is," Margaret said when he came back. "Most people out here are," Elias said. "They just needed someone to show them it was possible." He was looking at her when he said it, and she looked back at him, and the November air was cold and direct, and she felt it clearly. "Don't make me into something I'm not," she said. "I'm doing a job I'm trained for, and that needed doing." "I know what you're doing," he said. "I'm saying something about what it means to the people watching you do it." He held her gaze. "There's a difference." She didn't have an answer for that, so she went back inside. The threat, when it came, did not come in the form she had been expecting. It was 4 in the afternoon, 4 days after she had sent the letters, and she was in the study when she heard horses in the yard, not 1 or 2, but several, moving with the purposeful rhythm of a group that had organized itself before it arrived. She was at the window before she had decided to move. 4 riders. Dylan Aldridge in front, and behind him, 3 men she didn't recognize, broad through the shoulders, with the blank, patient expressions of men who were being paid to be somewhere and had no particular feelings about what happened when they got there. Chester came out of the barn. Billy appeared from the direction of the corral. Samuel moved to the corner of the house, which put him at an angle to the riders, a position that had not been discussed, but that was tactically obvious to anyone who had ever needed to cover multiple approaches. Elias came through the front door and stood on the porch. Margaret came and stood beside him. She saw Dylan register her presence, saw the slight calculation in his face whether her presence changed what he had come here to do, and his conclusion that it didn't. "Hartwell," Dylan said. "My father wants to have a conversation. He's prepared to make you a final offer. Come into town this afternoon, and this can all be handled civilly." "I've had your father's final offers," Elias said. "I've read the one he sent 3 days ago about the loan. Tell him my legal representative has formally disputed the Section 7 invocation, and that if he has further business, he can conduct it in writing." Dylan's eyes moved to Margaret. "Your legal representative? That's generous." The tone of it was designed to be insulting, without being specific enough to be answerable. "Miss Calloway, you've been busy. My father appreciates the effort. He wanted me to tell you that the firm of Aldrich and Moore in Philadelphia has confirmed they have no record of your employment. Margaret felt the ground of it carefully, the way you feel for ice on a crossing before you put your weight down. That's interesting, she said, because I have 7 years of signed correspondence and case files in my satchel that say otherwise, including 3 letters signed personally by senior partner James Moore, commending my work on the Weston title dispute. She kept her voice level. If Mr. Moore told your father I wasn't employed there, I'd be very curious what your father offered him to say so. Dylan's jaw tightened. There's going to come a point, he said, and the pleasantness had left his voice entirely now, where you'll wish you'd taken the stage home when you had the chance. I had the chance this morning, Margaret said, and yesterday morning. I expect I'll have it again tomorrow. Elias had not moved. He stood with his arms at his sides and his weight balanced, and his absolute stillness had the quality she had noticed the first day at the gate. Not the stillness of someone waiting, but the stillness of someone who had already decided and was simply watching for the moment. You've got no business on this property, Dylan, he said. You've delivered your message. Now ride back and tell your father that Elias Hartwell is not selling, not leaving, and not afraid of your hired company. His eyes moved briefly and deliberately across the 3 men behind Dylan. And that if any of these men sets foot on my land again without an invitation, I'll have them brought up on trespassing charges before the week is out. You'd bring charges before my father's court, Dylan said. I'd bring charges before the territorial court in Cheyenne, Elias said, which is where this matter is heading regardless. Your father knows that by now. Dylan looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Margaret again, and this look was different from the others, not contemptuous, but something that might have been closer to actual consideration, the kind of look someone gives a thing they've underestimated and are now reassessing. He pulled his horse around. The 3 men followed him without speaking, and the sound of hooves faded down the ranch road toward the county line. Chester let out a long breath. Billy said something under his breath that Margaret decided she hadn't heard. Samuel walked back from the corner of the house with the same unhurried composure he brought to everything. Elias turned to look at her. You handled that well, he said. You handled it better. She meant it. The composure he had held through that conversation, the absolute refusal to be moved or frightened or provoked into anything reckless, had been the steadying force that set the tone for the entire exchange. The Aldrich and Moore claim is something we need to address. If he's approached James Moore directly, can Moore be bought? I don't know. He's a practical man. If Aldrich offered him something and framed it as a protection against getting dragged into a Western property dispute, Moore might have made a pragmatic decision. She turned toward the house. I need to write to him tonight, directly. And I need to include enough specific case detail that he understands exactly how thoroughly I can document my employment history if this becomes a legal question. She paused. I want him to be more afraid of contradicting the record than of Aldrich. Can you make him more afraid of you than of Aldrich? She looked at him. I can make him understand that the truth is on record and that departing from it in a sworn statement carries federal consequences. She almost smiled. That's usually sufficient. They went inside. The evening was quieter than the previous ones had been, a quiet that had texture to it, the particular quality of people who have been through something together and are sitting in the aftermath of it. Chester cooked, Billy ate. Samuel read something. Elias sat across the table from her and went through the account books with the focused attention of a man who is doing arithmetic about survival. How bad is it? She asked. She had seen enough of the books to have her own estimate, but she wanted his. If Aldrich makes the 30-day notice stick, I can pull together maybe $800, selling the 2 prize bulls and the quarter horse stock. That leaves the working herd intact, but strips the breeding program back 3 years. He turned a page, 1400 short. The Section 7 challenge buys us time. If the marshal moves within 2 weeks, if, he said. Yes, she said, if. He closed the account book. He looked at her with the particular directness that she had learned was not aggression, but simply honesty. the look of a man who had decided a long time ago that the truth was less costly than its alternatives. "Margaret," he said, "I need to ask you something." "Ask." "If this doesn't work, if the marshal is too slow, or Aldridge finds a way to block the inquiry, or the note gets called and I can't make the payment." He held her gaze. "What happens to you?" She understood the question precisely. He was not asking about her professional prospects. He was asking what she had at stake in this outcome beyond the work itself. "I have nowhere particular to be," she said. "That's not self-pity. It's a fact. I came out here because there was nothing holding me in Philadelphia, and because I was recruited under false pretenses, and I wanted to know why." She looked at him steadily. "What I found when I got here was a piece of genuine injustice that I am professionally equipped to address. That's reason enough to stay." "Is it the only reason?" The kitchen was very quiet. She looked at him, at the careful, honest face of a man who had held his ranch together through 14 months of systematic attack without breaking, who had picked up the account books every night, knowing the numbers didn't work and done it anyway, who had put coffee at the corner of her desk without making it something that required discussion. "No," she said, "it isn't." He absorbed that. "All right," he said, not elaborating, not pressing, just holding the acknowledgement with the same steadiness he held everything. "The work isn't finished," she said. "I know." "When it is." "When it is." He said, "We'll talk." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she picked up her pen. That night at 11 o'clock, when she was finishing the letter to James Moore and the lamp had burned down to its last quarter, she heard Chester's voice outside the window, low and urgent, and then the sound of boots crossing the yard at a run, and then Billy's voice saying something she couldn't make out through the glass. She was at the front door before Elias reached the bottom of the stairs. Chester was coming across the yard from the direction of the eastern pasture, and even in the dark, she could read the urgency in his stride. He stopped at the porch steps and looked up at Elias with an expression that had no softness in it. "Someone's cut the fence on the eastern line," Chester said. "The boundary fence. The one that runs along the disputed parcel." "Cattle," Elias said. "Not cattle." Chester's voice was deliberate. "Someone's pulled the corner post, the one at the creek and road intersection." Margaret felt it land with complete clarity. The corner post at the intersection of the North Fork tributary and the county road. The physical landmark her affidavit described as the definitive boundary reference. The one fixed geographic point that Aldridge's paper survey could not move because it existed in the real world. Someone was trying to move it in the real world. "How long ago?" she asked. "Ground's disturbed, but the hole isn't frozen yet. Within the last 2 hours." Chester looked at her. "If they reset it 200 yards west and let it sit through a frost, it'll look like it's been there." Elias was already moving toward the barn. "Elias." Her voice stopped him. He turned. "Don't touch it," she said. "Don't move anything. Don't fill the hole, and don't reset the post." She held his gaze across the dark yard. "I need to document the disturbance exactly as it is. Measurements, position, soil condition. If Aldridge's men moved that post tonight, the disturbed ground is evidence of tampering, and I need it intact." He understood her immediately. She could see that. He stopped. "Samuel," he said without looking away from her. "Ride the eastern fence line and find where they went. Don't engage. Just find out which direction they came from, and whether they're still in the area." Samuel was on his horse in under 2 minutes. Margaret went back inside for her notebook, her measuring chain, and her compass, and she put on her coat and her boots, and she walked out into the cold, dark Wyoming night to document the crime that Victor Aldridge had just committed directly against his own case. She had asked Elias for time. Aldridge had just handed her something better than time. He had handed her proof. The ground around the post hole told the story clearly enough that Margaret didn't need lamplight to read it. She used her measuring chain and her compass by the light of the lantern Elias held, moving methodically around the disturbed earth while he stood without speaking, and Chester crouched at the edge of the hole and looked at the soil condition with the eyes of a man who had been reading land for 40 years. The post had been pulled cleanly, not broken, not rotted out, but extracted with deliberate effort and carried away, which meant whoever had done this had come prepared with tools and a plan, and enough time to execute both. She measured the distance from the hole to the creek bank. She measured the distance from the hole to the county road. She wrote everything into her notebook in the careful, specific language of a legal document, not her impressions, not her interpretation, but the physical facts as she could verify them with her instruments. The hole was 14 inches in diameter. The disturbed soil extended 18 inches in every direction from the rim. The distance from the hole's center to the near bank of the North Fork tributary was 42 feet 3 inches. The distance to the edge of the county road was 61 feet. She looked up at Elias when she was finished. The original deed describes the boundary reference as the intersection of the North Fork tributary and the county road, she said. I have now documented the exact location of the corner post hole, the physical evidence of where the post stood before tonight in precise measurements relative to both features. She closed the notebook. If Aldridge's men reset that post 200 yards west and claim it represents the true boundary marker, I can stand in front of a territorial court and demonstrate with documented measurements that the original post location is inconsistent with the repositioned one, and that the disturbed ground proves deliberate tampering. She held his gaze in the lantern light. He just created the physical evidence I needed, Chester said from his crouch beside the hole. Doesn't know what he handed her. He thought he was erasing evidence, Elias said quietly. He was creating it. That's what happens, Margaret said, when a corrupt man underestimates the people he's working against. Samuel returned 40 minutes later. He had tracked the riders south along the boundary fence to where the county road met the property line, and he had found the post still tied to a pack horse they had apparently left tethered a quarter-mile down the road, waiting for them to finish the job. They had been interrupted. Margaret understood by Chester's discovery they had not finished what they came to do. The post was still in the county, still in its original form, with its original markings, including the surveyor's chisel marks from the 1863 filing that matched the description in Elias's deed. Get it, she said. Samuel looked at Elias. Get it, Elias confirmed. He brought it back. Margaret held the lantern close and examined the chisel marks. Then she opened her father's satchel and pulled out the deed and found the description of the original survey marks. She read them against what she was looking at, character by character, mark by mark. They matched exactly. She stood up and looked at the three men around her, Elias, Chester, Samuel, and she said, "This post, in conjunction with the hole measurements and my documented affidavit, establishes a physical chain of evidence that a federal court cannot dismiss. Aldridge tampered with a survey marker on private property in an active legal dispute. That is not a civil matter, and it is not within his judicial jurisdiction. That is a federal crime." The night was cold and clear above them, the kind of clear that only comes after the temperature drops past a certain point, and the air stops holding anything back. Elias looked at the post in Samuel's hands, and then at the hole in the ground, and then at Margaret, and something shifted in his face. Not relief exactly, because the situation was not resolved yet, and he was too honest with himself to pretend it was. But the specific look of a man who has been fighting uphill in the dark for a long time and has just felt the ground begin to level. "What do we do now?" he said. "Now we preserve everything exactly as it is," she said. "The hole stays undisturbed. The post stays in my custody with a written chain of evidence document. And first thing tomorrow morning, we ride into town and file an emergency complaint with the territorial registrar documenting the tampering with a survey marker on property under active legal dispute." She put the notebook back in her satchel. "And we send a second letter to Marshal Rourke, not through the mail stage this time. By rider. Tonight." Elias looked at Samuel. Samuel was already moving toward the barn. Margaret wrote the rider letter in 20 minutes by the kitchen lamp, the fastest she had written anything in this entire process, because there was no longer any need for the careful, measured language of building a case. The case was built. This letter was a single direct statement of physical evidence gathered at a specific time and location, with a request for immediate response, and it was the kind of letter that a frustrated marshal who had been waiting 2 years for something concrete would read and be out the door before he reached the last paragraph. Samuel rode out at 1 in the morning with the letter and enough money for a fresh horse at the relay station. Margaret sat at the kitchen table after he left and did not go back to work, which was unusual enough that Elias noticed. He sat down across from her without being asked. "It's in his hands now," she said. "The marshal's. There's nothing more I can do tonight that will change what happens next." "That's a hard thing for you," he said. "Not as criticism, as observation." "I work better when there's something to work on," she admitted. "Waiting is not a skill I've cultivated." "No," he said. "You cultivate accuracy and persistence, and the ability to walk into a corrupt judge's office and come out with more information than you went in with." He said it matter-of-factly. "Waiting is a different muscle. What do you do with it?" "The waiting." He was quiet for a moment. "I check the things I can control, the stock, the fences, the people under my responsibility. I make sure everything I can account for is accounted for, and then I sit with the rest of it." He looked at her. "My grandfather used to say that the land doesn't care about your anxiety. It's going to be there in the morning either way. Might as well let the night do its work." She looked at him across the table, at this man who had held on to 1,900 acres and the integrity of a handshake and the memory of his grandfather's labor through 14 months of systematic assault, not through the absence of fear, but through the specific discipline of continuing anyway. "I'm glad I didn't take the $40, she said. "So am I," he said, "for reasons that go beyond the deed." The kitchen was warm, and the lamp was low, and she didn't look away from him, and he didn't look away from her, and the acknowledgement that had been building between them over the past 6 days through late nights and legal documents and cold rides and Dylan Aldridge's threats and the lamplight and the coffee set quietly at the corner of her desk sat between them now, without either of them moving toward it or away from it. "When this is over," she said. "When this is over," he said. They sat together in the kitchen until the fire burned down, not talking much, not needing to, and the house settled around them, and the wind came off the mountains, steady and unchanging, and the night did its work. Marshal Cade Rourke arrived in Clearwater 3 days later. He was not what she had expected, which was perhaps unfair, since she had no basis for expectation beyond Ruth's description of a man who was honest and frustrated. He was perhaps 50, compact and gray at the temples, with the kind of face that had arrived at its current expression after considerable experience with human dishonesty, and had settled into a permanent mild skepticism that she found professionally comforting. He read her affidavit in Ruth's store with the focused attention of someone who had been waiting for exactly this document and was checking it against a mental checklist. He looked up when he finished. "The notary seal on the boundary amendment." "J.P. Kramer," Margaret said. "Not on the county notary roll for any year. Not on the territorial notary registry. I have written confirmation from the Secretary of State's office." She placed the document on the counter. He picked it up, read it, set it down. "The post tampering. Documented the night it occurred with measurements compass bearings and the recovered post with original survey markings that matched the 1863 deed description precisely." She placed the second document. "Chain of evidence with witness signatures from 3 parties." He read that too. "And you are Margaret Calloway, legal clerk formerly of Aldrich and Moore, Philadelphia, currently acting as legal representative for Elias Hartwell of the Hartwell Ranch, Casper County. Aldridge claims Aldrich and Moore have no record of your employment. Aldridge contacted James Moore directly. I have Moore's original commendation letters for specific cases signed and dated which I can produce. I have also written to Moore directly informing him that any sworn denial of my employment history will be contradicted by documented case records and constitutes a false declaration in a federal investigation." She held the marshal's gaze. "I received his reply this morning. He has clarified that there was a misunderstanding in communication with Mr. Aldridge's representative and confirms my employment without reservation." Something that might have been appreciation moved briefly across Rourke's face. "You pushed him." "I gave him accurate information about the consequences of his options," she said. "He made a reasonable decision." Rourke looked at the stack of documents in front of him, and then at Margaret, and then at Ruth, who was leaning against the counter with her arms crossed, and the expression of a woman who has been right about something for 2 years and is exhibiting admirable restraint about it. 2 years, Rourke said quietly. 2 years I've been trying to get something actionable on Aldridge, and every time I got close the paperwork was clean. The paperwork was designed to look clean, Margaret said. But it was designed by someone who assumed no one with the specific expertise to identify the forgery method would ever look at it closely. She laid out the 3 boundary amendment filings side by side, Elias's and the 2 others. The same false notary, the same document number sequence pattern, 3 different properties. That's not a single fraudulent transaction. That's a systematic method. Which means every property Aldridge has acquired in the past 4 years needs to be reviewed against the same criteria. Rourke looked at the 3 documents side by side. He was quiet for a long moment. "How long would that review take?" he said. "Working alone 2 to 3 weeks. With a competent assistant 10 days. He looked at her directly. "Are you available?" She looked at him steadily. "I am working for Elias Hartwell. Any additional engagement would need his agreement and a separate fee arrangement." "Fair," Rourke said. "I'll talk to Hartwell." He rode out to the ranch that afternoon. Margaret was not present for the initial conversation between Rourke and Elias, which was deliberate. She wanted Rourke to understand that she was Elias's representative, and that her standing in this matter derived from his trust, not the other way around. She waited in the kitchen with Chester, who made coffee, and said nothing, which was the appropriate response. Elias came in 30 minutes later with Rourke behind him. "He wants to place Aldridge under federal jurisdiction today," Elias said. "Suspend his judicial authority pending investigation. That nullifies the Section 7 notice and freezes all active property proceedings in the county." Margaret looked at Rourke. "You have grounds for that now. Document forgery under territorial law, interference with a survey marker on property under active legal dispute, and a pattern of fraudulent filings across multiple properties." Rourke sat down. "That's enough for a federal suspension of judicial authority. The forgery charges alone carry a 5-year prison sentence under territorial statute." "And the properties," Margaret said. "The ones he acquired through forged amendments. If the amendments are fraudulent, the acquisitions built on them are legally void. The former owners or their heirs have standing to reclaim." He looked at her. "That's going to be a long process. Years, potentially. But it begins now." "It begins now," he confirmed. She turned to Elias. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen from him before. Not the almost smile, not the careful directness, but something more open than either. The expression of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time and has just been told he can put it down. "The deed holds," he said. "The deed was always correct," she said. "We just had to prove it." Rourke moved on Aldridge that same afternoon. Margaret was not there for the arrest, which happened at the land office, with the efficiency of a federal officer who had been waiting to execute this particular action for 2 years and had not forgotten a single detail of what needed doing. Ruth Beaumont told her about it that evening. Aldridge's face when Rourke walked in with the federal suspension order, the way Harlan Bowes had folded immediately and produced a written statement before anyone asked him, to the particular silence that fell over the street when word spread through the town that Victor Aldridge had been taken into federal custody. "Dylan?" Margaret asked. "Left this morning before Rourke arrived," Ruth said. "Rode south. Rourke has a notice out, but he's gone for now." She poured coffee. "He'll surface somewhere. Men like that always do." "He'll surface somewhere without his father's protection," Margaret said. "That's a different situation." Ruth sat down. "It's over." "The arrest is done," Margaret said. "The work isn't finished. The property reviews the recovery proceedings for the families he displaced that will take a long time. Will you stay for it?" Margaret looked at her coffee. "I told the marshal I could assist with the initial review. 10 days, possibly 2 weeks." She paused. "After that, it depends on other things." Ruth looked at her with those knowing eyes that had been reading people across this counter for 30 years. "Other things," she said. "Yes." Ruth nodded slowly. "He's a good man, Margaret. Stubborn as the land he works, and about as forthcoming with his feelings as that same land, but good in the way that holds when everything else gives way." She picked up her cup. "Don't make him wait too long. He's been alone in that house since his mother died, and he's forgotten he doesn't have to be." Margaret didn't answer that, but she remembered it. She rode back to the ranch in the late afternoon, with the sun going down behind the mountains in shades of copper and cold gold, and she could see the house from the top of the rise, the way she had seen it 10 days ago, when she walked up this road with her trunk and her carpet bag, and $11, and the particular certainty that comes from having nothing left to protect, except your own integrity. It looked different now. Not because it had changed, but because she had. Elias was on the porch when she rode in which she suspected was not accidental. He came down the steps and took her horse's bridle while she dismounted, and he stood close enough that she could see the specific quality of his expression. Clearly the open one she had seen that afternoon in the kitchen with Rourke, but quieter now, more deliberate, as if he had been thinking about what he wanted to say, and had decided to say it without armor. "Chester made supper," he said. "Chester always makes supper." "I know. I'm stating a fact while I work up to the other thing I want to say." She looked at him. "Say it." He did not look away. "You came here with nothing, and you rebuilt everything I'd been losing for 14 months. You walked into Aldridge's office on your first morning in this territory and came out with the evidence that eventually put him in federal custody. You documented a post hole in the dark at 1 in the morning because you understood it was the piece we needed." He paused. "And you did all of it while building something here in this house with these people that I didn't know I'd stopped believing was possible until I watched you do it." "Elias, I'm not finished." He held her gaze. "I've been alone in this house for a long time. Not because I had to be, but because I stopped trusting that the right person existed. Someone who could stand in this hard country and not break. Someone who would fight for this place the way it deserves to be fought for." He took a breath. "I was wrong to stop believing that. And I would like if you're willing to stop being wrong about it." She stood in the cold afternoon light and looked at this man who had put coffee at the corner of her desk and held a lantern steady while she measured a post hole in the dark and trusted her reading of a document when 3 other people had told him it was wrong, and she understood that what she felt for him was not gratitude, had not been only gratitude for several days now, and that she had been calling it something smaller than it was, because it was less frightening that way. She was done being frightened of things that deserved to be reached for. "I came out here to take a job that didn't exist," she said, "and I found work that mattered, and people worth fighting for, and a piece of land with a creek and a county road intersection that will stand in territorial legal precedent for the next 50 years. She looked at him steadily. "I also found you. And I would like very much to stop pretending that's a secondary consideration." He stepped forward, and she met him there on the cold ground in front of the porch, with the mountains going gold behind them, and when he kissed her, it was with the same quality as everything else about him, unhurried, certain, and completely honest, the kiss of a man who had decided and intended to honor what he had decided for as long as he was breathing. Billy whooped from somewhere in the direction of the barn. Chester's voice said immediately, "Shut up, Billy." They broke apart, and Elias made a sound she had never heard from him before. A real laugh, not the almost smile, not the barely there warmth, but something full and unguarded that transformed his face into something younger and lighter, and so genuine that she felt it in her chest like a struck chord. "Inside," he said. "Inside," she agreed. At supper, Chester shook her hand across the table without fanfare and said, "Good," which was the entirety of his response to the situation, and was somehow exactly right. Billy talked about the arrest in town, and the look on Aldridge's face, with the enthusiasm of someone narrating a story they expected to be telling for the rest of their life. Samuel said nothing, but when he passed her the bread, his expression was as close to warm as she had seen it, which from Samuel was significant. She wrote to Ruth that evening. A short letter, just enough to convey what Ruth's coffee and her counter and her steady eyes had given her in the first impossible hours of that first day. Ruth wrote back the next morning with characteristic directness. "About time. Come to supper on Sunday. Nora will be there." The property review took 11 days. Margaret worked alongside Marshal Rourke through every deed and amendment in the Casper County Registry that bore the J.P. Kramer seal, and she found it on 9 documents in total, representing 6 separate properties that Aldridge had acquired through forged boundary amendments over 4 years. She produced a comprehensive documented report that Rourke called the most thorough evidentiary package he had received in 20 years of territorial law enforcement, which she filed in the Marshal's office record under her full name and professional credentials. The Territorial Attorney General opened a formal investigation within the week. 3 of the 6 displaced families were located and notified of their standing to petition for recovery of their land. 2 of them came to the ranch to find Margaret before they went to the Marshal's office, because word had spread in the way that word spreads in a small county, not through official announcements, but through the texture of daily life, through what people said to each other at the feed store and the general store and across the fences of neighboring properties. They shook her hand and said things she did not know how to receive gracefully. So she received them as she received all things she didn't know how to handle directly without deflection, with honest acknowledgement that the work had been worth doing and that they deserved their land back, and that the law, when it worked the way it was supposed to, was not the enemy of ordinary people, but their most durable protection. Harlan Bowes testified against Victor Aldridge in exchange for a reduced charge. His testimony corroborated every element of the documented case and added 3 additional property transactions that Margaret had not yet reviewed. Victor Aldridge was remanded to federal custody in Cheyenne to await trial. He did not return to Clearwater. Dylan was found in New Mexico Territory 6 weeks later, trying a version of his father's methods in a county without a Margaret Calloway and without a Marshal Rourke. He was arrested on related charges and extradited north on a Saturday in December when the first hard snow had come and settled properly over the valley and the mountains were white against a sky the color of cold steel. Elias Hartwell asked Margaret Calloway to marry him. He did it in the study where it had all begun, standing beside the desk where the deed still sat in its oilcloth, wrapping the deed that had always said what he knew. It said that had always been correct, that had simply needed someone willing to read it accurately and stand behind that reading until the world caught up. He did not make a speech. He asked her plainly with the ring his mother had left in a box in the top drawer, a simple band with no stone worn smooth, with years of honest work. She said yes with the same directness she had brought to every other true thing in her life. They were married in the spring when the creek ran full with snowmelt and the county road was firm, and the North Fork tributary met that road at exactly the coordinates documented in the deed of 1863 and in Margaret's affidavit and in the territorial court's ruling that confirmed the Hartwell boundary once and for all. Ruth Beaumont stood as witness. Nora Finch cried, which she would deny for years. Chester shook Elias's hand and Margaret's hand with equal gravity. Billy threw his hat in the air and nearly lost it in the creek. Samuel smiled fully and completely, which Billy later claimed was the most remarkable thing that happened that day, including the wedding. The ranch grew steadily in the years that followed. The breeding program Elias had been forced to set back recovered within 2 seasons. The eastern pasture, confirmed and uncontested, carried the best cattle in the county. Margaret kept the books and managed the contracts and built a reputation in the territory as a legal clerk whose documentation you did not attempt to challenge because she would produce 17 corroborating sources and the challenge would not survive the afternoon. They had 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter, And Margaret taught all of them to read before they started school and to read a land deed before they were 12. Because the world was full of people who would attempt to tell you that a document said something other than what it plainly said. And the best protection against that was the specific, irreplaceable ability to read it for yourself and know the difference. On the 10th anniversary of the day, she had stood on the steps of the county registrar's office at 7:55 in the morning, waiting for a door to open. Margaret walked out to the eastern fence line alone in the November cold and stood at the corner where the post had been replaced. The original post with its 1863 chisel marks properly seated and legally certified at the intersection of the North Fork tributary and the county road. The creek ran over its stones. The road ran straight toward town. The mountains stood where they had always stood. Everything was exactly where it belonged. She had come to Clearwater, Wyoming Territory with $11 and her father's satchel, and the stubborn conviction that a lie always leaves a physical trace and you just have to know where to look. She had looked. She had found what she needed. She had built the case that needed building and stood behind it until it held. And in doing so, she had not only saved a ranch and restored 6 families to their land and put a corrupt judge in federal custody, she had built a life in this hard and honest country that was entirely and irrevocably her own. The wind came off the mountains cold and direct, and carrying the smell of snow. Margaret Calloway Hartwell turned back toward home. She had work to do, and she had never once in her life walked away from work that mattered. Part 5. Louis, Viet hai nghìn tam trum, den ba nghìn tu liên kết liên mật với các phần trước, trong câu chuyện phê hội thoại, tạo thành một câu chuyện liên mật khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liên mạch với phần trước không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới. Liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch. Sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần. Duy trì chủ đề. Tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phụ phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ Hoa Kỳ giống văn giàu cảm xúc chân thực và gần gũi mô tả cảnh ít tập trung vào hành động cảm xúc. Kể theo ngôi thứ 3, giữ độ kịch tính không viết lẩn mạn. Kết thúc dùng câu khẳng định mạnh để khép lại câu chuyện rõ ràng, trọn vẹn. Lưu ý trả lời trong mục tin nhắn, không nhảy sang mục document, 15-12. Orchestrated seamless narrative. Continuation with emotional depth and dialogue integration. Orchestrated seamless narrative. Continuation with emotional depth and dialogue integration. The post hole told its story to anyone willing to read it, and Margaret read it completely. She worked by lantern light for 40 minutes, moving around the disturbed earth with her measuring chain and compass, while Elias held the light steady, and Chester crouched at the rim of the hole and said nothing, which was his way of saying everything necessary. She documented each measurement in her notebook with the same precision she had used on every document in the past week. The diameter of the hole, the radius of disturbed soil, the compass bearing from the hole's center to the near bank of the North Fork tributary, the distance to the edge of the county road. She wrote it all down in the careful, specific language of a legal record, because that was exactly what it was. When Samuel returned with the recovered post, still bound to the stolen horse, she held the lantern close and examined the chisel marks cut into the base wood, then opened her father's satchel and pulled out the deed and found the surveyor's notation from 1863 and compared them mark by mark. They were identical. She looked up at Elias. This post in its original location at these documented measurements from the creek and the road is physical proof that the boundary described in your deed is exactly what you always said it was, she said, and the disturbed ground proves that someone tried to move it tonight. She closed the notebook. Aldridge just handed us a criminal act in addition to a forged document. He gave us the piece we were missing. Elias looked at the post in Samuel's hands. When he looked back at her, his expression was the one she had come to know over the past week, not triumphant, because he was not a man who celebrated before a thing was finished, but the particular steadiness of someone who has been fighting uphill for a long time and has just felt the incline begin to change. "Samuel," he said, "can you ride tonight?" "Yes," Samuel said. "Then ride." Elias looked at Margaret. "Tell me what to write." She wrote the letter to Marshal Rourke herself, standing at the kitchen table with her coat still on, the fastest she had written anything in this entire process. There was no need now for the careful layered language of building a case piece by piece. The case was built. This letter was a single direct statement. Physical evidence gathered at a specific location at a specific time. A recovered survey post with documented markings. A request for immediate response. And it was the kind of letter that a frustrated marshal who had been waiting 2 years for something actionable would read without setting down. Samuel rode out at 1 a.m. Margaret stood on the porch after he left and listened to the hoofbeats fade south toward the relay station, and then she stood in the cold quiet and let herself feel for just a moment the full weight of the past 10 days. The stage depot in Clearwater, where she had arrived with $11 and a fraudulent job offer. The registrar's ledger and the non-existent notary. The study and the deed and the 2 hours of work that had reframed everything. Dylan Aldridge's flat eyes in Ruth's store. The loan notice. Nora Finch writing at the kitchen table. The post hole in the dark. Each piece had led to the next with the relentless logic of a case that had always been true, waiting only for someone willing to trace it to its end. Elias came out and stood beside her. "Come inside," he said. "You've done enough for one night." "I need to write the formal tamper documentation before I sleep," she said, "while the measurements are fresh. Maggie." His voice was quiet and direct. "The measurements are in the notebook. The notebook will be the same in 3 hours as it is right now. Come inside." She turned and looked at him. He was watching her with those dark eyes that had never once in 10 days looked at her as anything other than exactly what she was. And she was tired in the specific way that comes not from weakness, but from sustained effort, fully expended, and the wind off the mountains was cold, and he was right. "All right," she said. They went inside. She slept for 4 hours and was at the desk at 6, and the formal tamper documentation was finished before breakfast. Marshal Cade Rourke arrived in Clearwater 2 days later. He read everything she gave him at Ruth's counter, working through each document with the focused attention of a man checking evidence against a list he had been carrying in his head for 2 years. The affidavit on the forged notary. The confirmation from the Secretary of State's office that J.P. Kramer's seal was not registered anywhere in the territorial system. The timeline she had built from the first boundary amendment filing through the loan notice through the fence line tampering. The recovered post and its documented measurements. Nora Finch's witness account. The 3 parallel forged amendments from other properties bearing the same false seal. He set the last document down and looked at her. 9 years, he said. "You've been doing this 9 years. "My father's work, then the firm," she said. "Land law primarily. Title searches, deed authentication, contract verification. Aldridge brought you out here specifically." "He identified someone with the credentials to certify his documents," she said. "He didn't anticipate that those same credentials would make it impossible to certify them without recognizing they were fraudulent." She paused. That was his miscalculation. Rourke looked at the stack of documents again. The pattern across all 3 properties, the same notary seal, the same document sequence method, that's not 3 separate frauds. That's a system. Which means every property Aldridge has acquired in 4 years needs to be reviewed against the same criteria, she said. "I've identified 9 documents bearing the false seal. There may be more." "How long to complete the full review?" 10 days working continuously. Fewer with assistance. He looked at her directly. "Are you available?" "I work for Elias Hartwell. Anything additional requires his agreement and a separate arrangement." "I'll talk to him," Rourke said. He rode out to the ranch that afternoon, and Margaret did not go with him because she wanted Rourke to understand from the beginning that her standing in this matter belonged to Elias first, and that was not a formality, but a fact she intended to maintain. She waited in the kitchen with Chester and drank coffee and did not pace, which required more discipline than the past 10 days of legal work had required combined. Elias came in with Rourke 35 minutes later. He can suspend Aldridge's judicial authority today, Elias said. Federal jurisdiction. It freezes the Section 7 notice and all active property proceedings. You have sufficient grounds, Margaret said to Rourke. It was not quite a question. Document forgery, tampering with a survey marker in an active legal dispute pattern of fraudulent filings across multiple properties. Rourke sat down. That's enough. The forgery charges alone are 5 years under territorial statute. The tampering elevates it to a federal matter regardless of Aldridge's local authority. He can't preside over a proceeding against himself, she said. He won't be presiding over anything, Rourke said flatly. Not after today. She looked at Elias. He was looking back at her, and his face had the expression she had seen the night at the post hole, not relief, but the easing of something that had been held under pressure for a very long time. The deed holds, he said. The deed was always correct, she said. We just had to prove it to the right person. Rourke went into Clearwater that same afternoon with the federal suspension order. Margaret was not there. She heard about it from Ruth the following morning. Aldridge's expression when Rourke walked through the door, Harlan Bowes folding immediately and producing a written statement before anyone asked the silence on the main street, when word moved from the land office outward through the town, the way word moves in small places, not through announcement, but through the texture of faces changing as people heard. Dylan left this morning, Ruth said. Before Rourke arrived, rode south. Rourke has a notice out, Margaret said. He does, but Dylan's gone for now. Ruth poured coffee. He'll surface somewhere. He'll surface somewhere without his father's name behind him, Margaret said. That's a different problem from the one he used to be. Ruth set down the pot and looked at her. It's done. The arrest is done. The review work isn't. Margaret picked up her cup. 9 documents minimum, possibly more. 6 families displaced, 3 of them locatable. The recovery proceedings are going to take months. Will you stay for it? Margaret looked at the counter. At the store that had been the first solid ground she found in this territory, the first place anyone had offered her coffee and honesty in the same breath. I told the marshal I'd assist with the initial review. After that, she paused. After that depends on other things. Ruth looked at her with those steady eyes that had been reading people across this counter for 30 years and said nothing, which was the most eloquent thing she could have said. Margaret rode back to the ranch in the late afternoon with the sun dropping behind the mountains and the cold coming down clean off the high country. She saw the house from the top of the rise, the smoke from the chimneys, the horses in the near corral, the barn with its repaired door that Chester had fixed 3 days ago without being asked. She had first seen this house 10 days ago with her trunk in one hand and her carpet bag in the other, and the specific clarity of a person who has run out of alternatives and found in that emptiness something like freedom. It looked like home. That was not a small thing, and she did not treat it as one. Elias was on the porch. She had suspected he might be, and she was right, and she found she was glad to be right about it. He came down the steps as she dismounted, and he stood close, the way he had been standing closer over the past several days, in the particular incremental way of 2 people who have been circling something true and have finally run out of reasons to keep circling. Chester made supper, he said. Chester always makes supper. She looked at him. That's not what you came out here to say. No. He held her gaze. I came out to say the rest of it, the part I've been working up to since approximately the second night when you fell asleep at my desk with your pen still in your hand, and I put a blanket over your shoulders and stood there for longer than was strictly necessary. She had not known about the blanket. She absorbed that quietly. You came here with nothing, he said. $11 and a satchel, and the kind of stubbornness that doesn't fold when a corrupt judge smiles at you and offers train fare home. And in 10 days, you rebuilt everything I'd been losing for 14 months. You walked into Aldridge's office on your first morning in this territory, and you took it apart from the inside. His voice was low and certain. "But it's not the legal work, Maggie. It's not the affidavit or the post-hole measurements or the letter that got Rourke here. It's the fact that you looked at this place and these people and you didn't calculate the risk and decide it wasn't worth it. You just stayed. And the staying—" He stopped. "The staying changed what this house feels like, and I would be dishonest if I didn't tell you that directly." She had received difficult news in her life with composure. She had held her father's hand while he died and not broken. She had stood on a train platform in Wyoming with no money and no prospects and kept her chin level. She had looked Dylan Aldridge in the face and not flinched. Standing in front of this man in the cold afternoon light, hearing him say true things about her in plain language without armor or strategy, was harder than all of it. "I came here to take a job that didn't exist," she said. "And I found work that mattered and a place worth fighting for." She held his gaze. "I also found you, and I stopped calling that secondary approximately 5 days ago." He stepped forward, and she met him there in the cold dirt in front of the porch steps, and he kissed her with the same quality she had come to know in everything about him: unhurried, certain, absolutely honest. She kissed him back with everything she had, all the courage and stubbornness and capacity for sustained effort she possessed, because this was not less serious than the work, and she intended to treat it accordingly. From the direction of the barn, Billy Oakes made a sound of pure, unconstrained joy. Chester's voice said immediately and firmly, "Billy." Elias made a sound against her hair that she had never heard from him before, a full laugh, real and unguarded, the laugh of a man who has remembered that certain things are allowed to be simple and good. She felt it in her chest like something long frozen beginning to move. "Inside," he said. "Inside," she agreed. At supper, Chester shook her hand across the table without preamble and said, "Good," and went back to eating, which was exactly the right amount of words. Billy told the story of Aldridge's arrest with the enthusiasm of someone who understood he was narrating a legend and intended to do it justice. Samuel passed her the bread with something on his face that on a less reserved man would have been called a smile, and on Samuel constituted an event. She wrote to Ruth that evening briefly because Ruth deserved to know first. Ruth wrote back the next morning in her direct, no-excess style, "About time. Come to supper Sunday. Bring him. Nora will be there, and she will cry and deny it." The property review took 11 days. Margaret worked alongside Rourke through every deed and amendment in the Casper County Registry that bore J.P. Kramer's fraudulent seal documenting the pattern with the thoroughness that the case required, and that her training made possible. She found the false seal on 9 documents total, representing 6 families displaced from their land over 4 years. She produced a comprehensive evidentiary report that Rourke filed with the Territorial Attorney General's office under her full name and professional credentials, the most complete documentation of a systematic judicial fraud the Territory had recorded. The Attorney General opened a formal investigation within the week. Harlan Bowes testified in exchange for reduced charges, and his testimony added 3 transactions Margaret had not yet reached. Victor Aldridge was remanded to federal custody in Cheyenne. He did not come back to Clearwater. 3 of the 6 displaced families were located and notified of their legal standing. 2 of them came to the ranch before they went to the marshal's office, because in a small county word moves through the daily texture of life faster than any official channel. And they had heard that there was a woman at the Hartwell Ranch who had done what no lawyer in 100 miles had been willing to do. They came and stood in the kitchen and said things she received directly and without deflection because they deserved to say them, and she had learned in this hard, honest country that deflecting a true thing was its own kind of dishonesty. In December, on a Saturday, when the first real snow had settled over the valley and the mountains stood white against a steel sky, Elias asked her to marry him. He did it in the study beside the desk where the deed lay in its oilcloth, and he used his mother's ring, a plain band worn smooth with years of work, and he asked her plainly, in the same way he did everything without performance, without strategy, with complete and unhesitating honesty. She said yes. They were married in the spring in the yard of the ranch when the creek ran full with snowmelt and the county road was firm, and the North Fork tributary met that road at the precise coordinates recorded in the 1863 deed and in Margaret's affidavit and in the territorial court's final ruling on the Hartwell boundary, which was entered into the record on a Tuesday in February, and which no one in Casper County attempted to contest. Ruth Beaumont stood as witness. Nora Finch cried and denied it for years afterward. Chester shook Elias's hand, and then Margaret's, with the same grave respect he gave to everything that deserved it. Billy threw his hat in the air so enthusiastically it landed in the creek, and Samuel, stone-faced Samuel, who had said perhaps 40 words in the entire time Margaret had known him, retrieved the hat and handed it back to Billy, with an expression of such complete and open warmth that Billy later claimed it was the most astonishing thing that happened that day, a claim that held up surprisingly well, considering the day also included a wedding. The ranch grew in the years that followed steadily and without drama, which was the kind of growth that lasts. The eastern pasture, confirmed by law and by the physical facts of the land, and by the documented measurements of a woman with a compass and a measuring chain, carried the finest cattle in the county. Margaret kept the books and managed the contracts and built a reputation across the territory as a legal clerk whose documentation you did not attempt to challenge because the attempt would not survive the afternoon. Dylan Aldridge surfaced in New Mexico Territory, trying a version of his father's methods in a county where no one had heard of him. He was arrested, extradited north, and convicted on charges derived in part from the evidentiary pattern Margaret had documented in Casper County. His father's trial took 2 years and resulted in 5 years federal imprisonment and the legal voiding of every property acquisition built on a forged boundary amendment. 3 of the 6 families reclaimed their land. Margaret taught her children 2 sons and a daughter, each of them with their father's dark eyes and their mother's specific kind of stubbornness, to read before they started school and to read a land contract before they were 12. She taught them that a document says what it says, not what someone tells you it says, and that the difference between those 2 things is the difference between justice and its absence, and that knowing the difference is not a luxury but a responsibility. On the 10th anniversary of the morning, she had stood on the steps of the Casper County Registrar's office at 7:55 with her measuring notebook and her compass, and the particular cold clarity of someone who has decided to look at a thing directly and read it accurately, no matter what it costs. Margaret walked out alone to the eastern fence line in the November air. She stood at the corner post. The original post, with its 1863 chisel marks, properly seated in properly certified ground at the intersection of the North Fork tributary and the county road, exactly where Elias's grandfather had placed it, exactly where Elias had always known. It stood exactly where the deed said it was, and where it would remain as long as the creek ran and the road held and the mountain stood behind it. The water moved over its stones. The road ran straight toward town. The cold air came off the high country, carrying the smell of coming snow. She had arrived in this territory with $11 and her father's leather satchel, and a belief that a lie always leaves a physical trace if you know where to look. She had looked. She had found what the evidence demanded finding. She had built the case that needed building and stood behind it until it held, and in doing so, she had not only saved a ranch and returned 6 families to their land and put a corrupt judge in federal custody. She had built something of her own in this hard, honest, unforgiving country. Something that was entirely and permanently hers. A life built on accurate reading, on stubborn truth, on the knowledge that the right words in the right document, read clearly and defended completely, are more durable than any lie that tries to replace them. She turned back toward the house, toward the smoke rising from the chimneys, and the sound of her children's voices, and the man who had held a lantern steady in the dark, while she measured a post hole and trusted her reading when no one else had. Margaret Calloway. Hartwell walked home through the cold November air, and she had never once in her life walked away from work that mattered, and she was not about to start now.